Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sire here today to discuss with you a brand new topic for us as we enter this new term of learning, which is going to be around the French Wars or the Napoleonic Wars. There are various names for this era of history, but this is what we're going to be focusing on, and this is going to concern us with the British perspective most of all. As always, it's important to stress that these lessons are catered towards the student level, so our content will provide us with some key knowledge, and the video will be dedicated to practicing our historical skills throughout. With all that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So yes, this is a brand new topic we're going into for this term, which concerns the British perspective during the French Wars. And this is going to entail a lot of different things. We're going to look at various leaders, various battle campaigns that have happened, the types of combat that occurred in this era of war. For those of you who joined me for our First World War series, you'll know all a lot about our early 20th century combat there. And there are some similarities, but now we're going over 100 years prior to that, and things are going to be quite a bit different to how combat is fought back then. And of course, the reasons for why the war has happened as well. This is going to be quite a complex era of history to get into. And so, our first few videos in the series, background detail, what's the combat like, what's the political situation in the world, what even is the world like. That's really what we're going to be delving into in our video series. And so, without further ado, let us get ourselves into what exactly we're talking about here when we say French Wars and this time era that we're in, the 1790s into the 1810s. So first off, I want us to have a quick look here at a map of Europe in 1792. Feel free to pause the video and just have an observation of it. What exactly can you see in this image? There we are, very good. And so you should have noticed a few key things that are quite different within it. For instance, we do have some familiar faces. We obviously have Great Britain, we have France and Spain, and Russia over here. But there's quite a bit of difference when we get into the middle portion of our map here. For instance, we do still have Poland. Poland's a very different shape to how it is now. And of course, we have this swath of land down here, the Ottoman Empire. So you will, of course, remember me mentioning the Ottoman Empire in our First World War series, but here we find it is actually still really large, and in some ways, it's still the sick man of Europe as it is in our 1900s timeline, but it is still here now, and it's still an empire in itself. But the biggest difference is really what's happening here in Central Europe, and this is where a lot of our combat in the Napoleonic Wars is going to take place. And so it's very important we understand these various areas we find ourselves in. We're still going to have Austria and Hungary, they're still here, but we also have another nation called Prussia. Yes, this is the biggest detail that is different with our modern map today. Germany does not actually exist. The Germanic people, of course, still are real and they are still present, but Germany as a nation is not yet created yet. And so it still is very fragmented, it's still into its various portions and various parts, and Prussia is the main one we'll be needing throughout our series as we go forth. So do just bear that in mind, we still have many empires here, but Europe itself is quite a different landscape back then to what we know it as right now. So, yes, before we go any further, I also want to clarify what exactly we mean by the term French Wars. Now, French Wars is going to encompass our entire timeline we're going to explore right from 1790 up to 1815. But when we get to the 1800s, it's more appropriately called the Napoleonic Wars. We're going to meet someone known as Napoleon Bonaparte, and a lot of the combat that happened in this era is down to his expansionist beliefs, his idea that France should take over much of Europe and rule the majority of it. And so his campaigns are going to be the Napoleonic era, where he's trying to take over these nations, even though the nations that are still fighting against France, Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, are still more or less the same. And the final way this may be called when you're researching your historiography is the coalition wars. And this is because there's going to be various coalitions. There are six different ones and also a seventh, very minor, short lived one that is not really needing much detail. And so they make up various coalitions, but again, it's essentially France's allies against Britain's allies. And so there's no real major difference on that landscape. But again, it's important to bear that in mind. When you see the videos on my channel, some are going to be called French Wars, some are going to be called Napoleonic, and in my video, I'll probably be using the terms interchangeably as I'm talking about them. As said as well, we're going to be looking at the British perspective most of all. So, although there are various coalition wars, we're not necessarily going to look at them all in the same detail as others. And there's only so much we can fit into our curriculum time, and so we're going to have to be be very choosy in which ones we explore in greater depth. Of course, as always, there'll be wider reading throughout my videos, so feel free to check them out if you want to expand a certain part of this era into greater detail. But first, before we get on to the actual combat itself, this is an introductory video, so we need to also understand the background, the political and contextual background that has happened by the 1790s. So, where exactly does this warfare begin for us? There's so many places we could start and pick this. Those of you who may have done some French revolutionary history would be very well appropriately equipped. I'll try and give you a bit of a summary, a bit of a background into what the situation is when we get into the early 1790s. So we will begin with the French Revolution. Now, we don't need to know the exact details of what exactly is happening in the French Revolution, what caused it. What we can say, though, is that by 1789, there was a lot of pressure that had fallen upon France. There had been uprising and rebellions within the nation, along with growing hostility with other European countries who felt threatened by the revolution that was going on there. One of the key challenges for the French government was that is it was facing this claim French people were not free. Now, France had been a monarchy for many hundreds of years, and this new idea had been evolving in France's political climate that maybe the monarchy should not be the thing that rules all of France and all its people, and perhaps the people could rule themselves. So, therefore, because it was gaining success, because we have Louis XVI fallen, because the French National Guard had been defeated, and now the sans-culottes and various other French resistance movements had taken power, the monarchs in Europe felt very threatened by this idea. They believed that this revolution could spread and therefore challenge their own authority of their own monarchies. And so this led to the creation of our first coalition, which was France on one side against the nation of Great Britain and practically the rest of continental Europe, like Austria, like Prussia. As might be expected, the war did not go well for France. France had been bankrupt for many years now and has suffered many financial problems. And by 1793, the government was under extreme pressure. And so it passed this thing called the Decree of the Levée en Masse, which was a conscription of all young men between the ages of 18 to 25. And it was trying to inspire all the French citizens to try and fight for the cause. However, in doing so, it was also impeding on people's liberties. By early 1792, the Revolutionary Army was considered a shambles both at home and abroad. In fact, in a battle in April time of that year, no one was really surprised when all these new conscripts from the Levée en Masse chose to run away, and in one company they even lynched their commanding officer as well. However, things changed when a young artillery captain of the name Napoleon Bonaparte began to experience some success in the war. He proved quite capable, quite revolutionary, many would say, in his combat tactics. And we're going to see when we get into my combat video for artillery, he made some very, very effective innovations in how combat could be fought. By 1796, the French Revolutionary now comprised the largest army in all of Europe, and they used it to extend their territory. French society was also transformed, having fallen under called the Great Terror under someone called Maximilien Robespierre. The army, now a political operative supervising the generals, hesitation, disobedience, and of course defeat, now meant outright death and execution for all those who resisted. In fact, in 1793 alone, 17 generals had been publicly executed, and in 1794, when the terror really gathered pace and many faced death by the guillotine, a further 67 met the same fate. This era of the Great Terror was seen as one where the civilian population was really pressured by the government. The economic resources of the nation were fully mobilized to supply their massive army. The priority was weapons. The French government made sure there were 20 new sword and bayonet factories and 20 new gun factories. The biggest, unsurprisingly, was in the capital city of Paris, producing as many muskets as the rest of Europe put together. Transport and industry were also brought under government control to ensure that prices could be controlled and that workers, property, and products were all requisitioned for the war effort. And so that's the general background there for why the wars are overcurring. Essentially, it's France. France is the one causing problems. France is the one who's having a big change in its political government with its people, and the rest of Europe is rallying to try and control and contain that to stop it spreading and harming their own nations. But what exactly is the French threat? And what exactly is the rivalry that it has with the Great British Empire? So it's very important then we discuss this rivalry in a bit of detail. In modern times, as we know, the French and British were allies, especially during the First World War and later on the Second World War. However, up until the 1800s, they were fierce rivals with one another. The two states competed for colonial overseas territory and wanted trade and diplomatic influence in Europe. France had actually aided the American rebels during their War of Independence against the British in the 1770s and 80s, and after the French Revolution, the British government now saw itself as having to challenge this French regime that was threatening the stability and social order within Europe. Britain formed these alliances with Austria and Prussia to ensure that it could intervene to support the monarchy in France. However, France had took the initiative by declaring war on Austria and Prussia first. And so we're going to see throughout this era from 1790 to 1815, France is consistently at war with the rest of Europe and especially Britain. So let's of course outline some key differences between these nations. I'm going to put a summary on the screen for you here, but a bit of detail is always quite helpful. It's important to understand that France is, of course, a bigger nation. It has a population that is roughly twice that of Britain. However, Britain by this time is a very industrialized nation. In fact, after the Netherlands, it is the second most urbanized country in all of Europe. And its economy was fastly developing as it was undergoing a revolution in manufacturing and working life. It also had access to its overseas markets in its very expansive empire, having a very stable and arguably sophisticated financial system to support itself in a war effort, especially for this time in the 1790s. It also has something called income tax, which it later made official in 1798, which was an innovation to help finance the cost of the war. It also meant that because it was so financially strong, it could fund its coalition allies like Austria, Prussia, and later on Russia. And in doing so, by giving this money to them and having the financial strength to do so, it could ensure these nations were a very powerful and viable part of the war throughout the era. It also had a very vast and powerful Royal Navy that had been funded since its conflict in the Seven Years' War in the 1750s. The Navy ensured that Britain's maritime trade and colonies were fully protected, all the way from Canada to the East India Trade Company, and ensured that France was unable to challenge it at sea. By contrast, though, France was a much larger nation, as we said, and therefore had a much larger army. Yes, of course, because of the Levy en Masse, many of them were conscripts at this time, but all the same, it was quite powerful. And while not having a domineering navy the way Britain did, it still did have ships itself, but it was really making innovations with artillery. We'll be saying a lot about that and Napoleon's use of artillery, and we'll get into some later battles in the era. However, its downsides were it was struggling financially and was really finding it difficult to ensure its debts were paid and that its people could thrive again after so many long years, some would argue decades, in abject poverty. Britain, by contrast, did have a much smaller army. At the start of the era, it only had an army of about 40,000 strong. What we're going to see is something that's going to grow throughout the era until it's going to peak at the Battle of Waterloo with an army of the size of 250,000 men. In many ways, though, the nations were at a stalemate. Britain indeed dominated the waves, it dominated the sea war, but Napoleon in France and Europe had the land advantage and therefore clearly could keep the British out for many years to come. We're going to see these nations are going to have quite an expansive war with one another, ranging from the peninsula in Spain and Portugal right up into Europe and, of course, the trade networks around it. But it's all good knowing the general rivalry between the two nations, but there are also some key military leaders which we have to be aware of as well, the deeper part of our series. And these two men will need to know a lot of detail about are Horatio Nelson and Arthur Wellesley. You'll probably better know Arthur Wellesley as the Duke of Wellington and later a Prime Minister in the middle of the 1800s. Now, why do we need to know these two individuals? Because the key idea in our topic is we talk about the economy, we talk about the state of the army and the navy and the power of the troops within them. But key factor, much like in our World War One series, has been about leadership and was the great men idea of history, the leaders who are above the sailors, above the marines, and above the soldiers, truly warranted for being celebrated as heroes rather than simply leaders and men who fought alongside. So we're going to learn about these two individuals in much more detail. We're going to learn about the tactics, the battles they fought in, and where they currently stand in history, and perhaps as well the historiography around them. And of course, for our series especially, the extent that their leadership can be heralded as the reason for great British victories during this era. Or, in fact, was it other factors? Was it French weaknesses? Was it the soldiers' competence? Or was it even just the strength of the British economy as a whole that allowed them to be so successful? Again, we're going to go into more detail, but the background to know right now is Horatio Nelson is a very, very victorious naval commander. He's going to have many campaigns in the 1790s, peaking with some would argue his greatest battle of all, Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. And for Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, he's going to have a lot more campaigns later in the year, at the Peninsular War in the 1800s, and then, of course, peaking with his great battle against Waterloo, when he finally combated against Napoleon Bonaparte himself. And so there we are, class. That is our introductory video in regards to our French Wars series. Thank you as always for watching and listening. I hope you found this quite useful, quite insightful. Again, it's just an introduction. The following videos will outline some key battle tactics, the land warfare and the naval warfare. So we're going to learn a lot more about this as we go forward. So do stick around for that. Make sure you are subscribing and of course do like and comment on the video. Your engagement is always appreciated. So I look forward to exploring this historical era with you and hope we learn quite a lot on the way together. For all that said, this has been History with Sire. Thank you for listening.